Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Ilana from the staff from A4Q Congress staff. Today's topic is the key features and benefits of TickITplus. We have Mr. Dave Wynn, who is a managing director of Omniprove with 35 years experience in the EAT industry. He has spent over 12 years actively involved with the management, procurement, design, development, test, and integration of real-time software systems, primarily in the defense sector. Welcome, Mr. Dave.
Okay. So good evening, everyone. I hope you're having a good conference. I'd just like to go over a few aspects of the TickITplus scheme. Some of you may have heard of it, particularly focusing on some of the key features and benefits of using TickITplus. So I'd like to just sort of press on. First of all, a little bit of background to TickITplus. TickIT was the original scheme introduced back in the late 80s, following the first release of 9001 in 1987, which was aimed very much at the manufacturing industry and the Department of Trade and Industry in the UK sort of felt the need to introduce something to bring in place something that sort of converted or translated the ISO standard speak into what was more familiar to software engineering, software development. It was aimed primarily at the software sector. It wasn't a standard as such, but it was a certification scheme using ISO 9001 as the standard. And it had 6 parts in it. Introduction to TickIT and the certification process, guide to customers, guidance to suppliers, auditors, software quality management system requirements, standards perspective. And I think most importantly, it referenced ISO IEC 12207, which is a software quality management system requirements for from a process perspective. So the very early stages of talking about processes. When we came to look at it back in around about 2009, from the committee, the JTISC Joint Ticket Industry Steering Committee, which had been running from the late 80s, we looked at it and we sort of looked back, and there was an emphasis on quality inspection and control at the time. It was aimed primarily at software development. As I said, it was only guidance. And one of the interesting things with all standards, to be fair, is that it was it only really provided a pass-fail results. And we started to look at what was going on currently around about 2009. And what we found was that there was a greater emphasis on process capability and improvement, that the IT sector was much more diverse than it was back in the late 80s. A lot more impact on business from IT and software, more concern around business continuity, security, safety, etc. And looking at the sort of industries that were using TickIT, they were really clearly requiring or valuing clearly defined requirements rather than just guidance, which was a bit woolly, and organizations couldn't really get their hands around the guidance in terms of actually implementing a good management system for software development. And we also found that there's a much better desire, or much greater desire, for better differentials in supplier selections. Everybody that wanted ISO had got ISO, irrespective of whether they were implementing it adequately or they were implementing it in a very good way. Everybody had ISO 9001. So we on the committee worked on developing TickIT. I think the biggest challenge was just finding a new name for it, and eventually the easy answer was just to add plus. So some of the things I want to talk about within the scheme, it's quite not complex, but it's an all-embracing scheme. But some of the things I want to talk about: multiple standards, its flexibility, joint assessment teams, measurable improvements, and outcomes over outputs, which we'll go into. So before we go further, I think it's always useful to step back and to ask the question, what is quality? So I thought about that, and I reflected back to when I was 17, a bit older now, and that was my first car. It was a British Racing Green Mini, and I thought about what we call it, and as we say in Yorkshire, it were right good quality. And the reason for us using that phrase and thinking about what we meant by good quality, we looked at it, and really what quality means is delivering customer satisfaction. And that means having the right thing, what we need, the right tools, the right product that we want, for the right price, and getting it when we need it. And for me, a 17-year-old, hadn't even passed my driving test. It did what I wanted to do. It allowed me to get around. I could afford it, and I got it when I needed it, just leading up to my driving test, which I failed, by the way. So when we look at quality systems, what are we really talking about? Are we talking about this word quality system? Well, I really don't think we are, because quality is all about, as I just said, customer satisfaction, or my satisfaction when it came to getting the car that I wanted at the time. So what we're really looking at is not really quality systems at all. What we're looking at is our delivery systems, or management systems, or better still, business systems. And that's what we should be focusing on, almost dropping the word quality and thinking about what are we trying to achieve. So what do we mean by systems? Well, within the process world, or within the management system world, or the ISO certification world, when we talk about systems, we're talking about two key components really, and that's people, and that's tools, facilities, and equipment. And you've got to look at things like this. And really today, neither one of those gives organizations competitive advantage in the long term. Clearly, the short term it does, but for a longer term, it really doesn't give those organizations that advantage, because people move on, they change jobs. I know we're in a market at the moment because of COVID where people are keeping their heads down a little bit. The markets are not demanding, but we're going to come out of that, and people are going to start wanting to move around. And if you've built your organizational success on the back of purely people, you're going to run into some risks and issues. Tools, facilities, equipment, again, you can't really have that competitive advantage just because you've got the best tools, facilities, and equipment, because unless you develop them yourselves, everybody can get hold of those same tools, facilities, and equipment and use them as well. Now, if you just put people and facilities and tools together, you really do end up with a bit of chaos, anarchy, confusion. Who really knows what's being done? And what you need to do, and this is where the competitive advantage comes about, is you've got to introduce process. And process is your prerogative. It's your right. It's your way of doing it. And you have the competitive advantage over other people by having good process in place. And that's what we need to do, is to think about the processes that bring people, equipment, and facilities together in a business environment to give customer satisfaction, or to deliver the customer satisfaction what you want to do. And one of the things that TickITplus has tried very hard to do is to move away from just the singular standard approach. And this is a common theme these days. There has been a lot of work done within the standards committee to Annex SL, for example, was introduced to introduce a common feel, a look and feel to the standards, but they still exist as separate standards. And what we've done in TickITplus is try to integrate those standards under one umbrella within the TickITplus scheme. We still have ISO 9001 as the core standard. It's a very good standard. It's very generic. It's improved hugely over the years from the early days of maybe what we would call, quality inspection or quality control, through quality management, and through into quality assurance. So it's evolving all the time. And TickITplus has tried to take that and then build in other standards. And to date, we've incorporated ISO 27000 security management, ISO 20000 on service management. We've built in ISO 26262, which is functional safety. We've incorporated PAS 754, which has now been superseded, which is on trustworthy software. So we're bringing in these other standards, and we're looking at further standards like ISO 12207, 15288, which have got some more popularity these days. And we're trying to bring them in as well to sort of integrate them in, so that rather than organizations having to do the cross mappings, it's the TickITplus scheme itself that has done it and shows you where those links and those overlaps exist. You can get all the information. It's all free. There's no costs involved from www.TickITplus.org. You can get hold of the base process libraries, the core scheme requirements, and other documents from that site. Just looking a little bit into the TickITplus scheme, there are 40 processes defined in it, which pretty well cover all the expected or recognized processes that are involved with software development and indeed systems engineering. And I could even go further and say actually they're involved with any intellectual effort where brain power is required, design. You could apply them as well, because the principles that we've written in are not specifically software principles. They're basic, what we call engineering principles. Plus, we've also got the sort of management elements, the mandatory type A processes, we call them, that are around the governance and management of the processes. And there are some high maturity processes, which I'll cover a little later. So for each process, we've broken it down into, we try very hard to have a process on a page to make it simple to read. Each process has a purpose that's stated in simple terms. It has one or more outcomes. It has a number of base practices that, if are implemented as we've indicated, would help achieve the purpose to deliver the outcome. There are input and output work products, and on the right-hand side, you can see how we've mapped all the clauses of the standards into our base practices. So that's what the TickITplus scheme looks like in terms. But I wanted to move on to how can we use TickITplus to benefit organizations and give some real improvement benefit. The first thing I thought about is what is a process, okay? The value of processes. I'm sure you all remember the Rubiks cube. Interesting device. Many of us have tried it. I don't know if you know, but there are 43 quintillion starting states for the Rubiks cube. I do accept that if you, for example, rotate the top layer there, it will look the same, but technically it is a mathematically different starting state. Now, my question really is, how many methods are there to solve a Rubik's Cube? Now, I don't mean moves, I mean methods. And in fact, I could ask the same question with anything. How many methods are there to solve any problem, to solve any software development systems engineering problem? And I would come to the conclusion that in principle, in this world, there are basically three methods to most things. Particularly when we come to sort of engineering or design. The first one, which I'm sure most of you, particularly myself, which we could solve it randomly. We could just twiddle the Rubik's Cube until maybe one day it slots into place and we're satisfied. The chances of that happening out of 43 quintillion, pretty remote, I would have suggested. The second one, now I'm sure some of you maybe sort of recognize this, maybe not in your own organizations, but you may have heard about it or record. We can do it dubiously. We could dismantle it and we could put it back together so that it looks right. The problem with that is we haven't been through any of the requirements of if this is a process. We haven't been through any of the requirements that are mandated within the process. We've simply jumped from the starting position to the end position. And again, in the real world, who knows what we've admitted in doing that. So it might look good, but believe me, there are potential serious risks of doing it that way. Now, the third way to do it is successfully, and we can follow a process. And I looked it up, and you can actually solve the Rubik's Cube in no matter which position it starts in out of those 43 quintillion positions in a minimum of 26 moves by following a well-defined process. Now, if you think about that, you know, most of us may all be sitting in the random category. There may be a few who would love to do the dubious category. There may be a few heroes amongst us that can do it naturally themselves. My 19-year-old lad can do it whilst drinking a pint of beer. But most of us won't be in that category. But think, if we've got a very well-defined process, suddenly we can all do it by following that process. Now, we might start off slow, but after repeatability of the process, we will start getting much quicker and much faster at doing it, and we'll be more successful more of the time. So process, if it's defined right and is reflective of what we're trying to achieve, can be extremely powerful tool. And I'm sure you've all heard that said many times. So what we do with a process, we typically pick up a model, a system model, like ISO 9001 or indeed TickITplus or any of those models. Now, what we think of as a model is a kit of parts, you know, the good old Airfix kit of parts. The problem with the kit of parts is that it results in one thing and one thing only. And not everything's the same. Not all business is the same. What we really want are a set of building blocks that we can put together in a way that achieves the results that we want it to achieve in our own organization. You know, even down to solving the Rubik's Cube. And now that's what we're after doing, because, you know, we don't want just a off-the-shelf quality management, business management, whatever you want, system that says we'll do it this way. We need to be able to construct it. And TickITplus gives us that ability through the components within the TickITplus scheme. Now, to start with, I've already mentioned the processes on the right-hand side. So just going from right to left, all the processes have in it the mappings to the standards. And as we incorporate or as you adopt further standards, more of the practices become applicable. So more of the outcomes become applicable. So you can see here that the outcome 1, OU1, is applicable if you're doing pretty well all the standards. Outcome 2 only comes into play when you're looking at PAS 754. And outcome 3 only comes into play when you're actually looking at ISO 26262. So we've got the ability to tailor the actual details within the TickITplus scheme depending on what particular standards you're interested in looking at. Now, the whole scheme itself is tailorable through what we call scope profiles, and that really focuses in on the type of management system that you want to put in place. For example, the most common one is systems and software development and support. That's the sort of legacy one back from the days of TickIT. But there are also other management systems you might want to adopt, such as service management or information management and security or IT systems engineering and infrastructure. And what we've got within the scheme is a mapping table that takes the processes that we've got and maps them to the scope profile. So we've got another layer of tailoring or flexibility to adjust what's needed based on the requirements of the organization. So we've looked at the flexibility. So the scheme is designed to be very flexible and grow with additional standards as we come along, and you can adopt those additional standards as the organization feels fit. The real question comes to, though, about how do you take those processes that we've got, and how do you create and define your own processes within your own organization? The first thing that came across my mind is the legacy approach. And I asked the question, saying this is an effective management system is like saying this is an effective watch. In both cases, all the parts of the system were there, the management system, all the procedures were there. They're all written out, all very well defined and everything. But as with the watch, all the parts are there. But the problem with the watch is it doesn't actually tell the time. So just having all the bits isn't really the problem. You've got to integrate those bits properly and sensibly to deliver what you want to deliver. So how do we do that? Well, we need to look at, again, going back to the people and the tools. And we've got to really take into account the level of competence of people and the level of advancement and automation of tools in that. And when we start looking at that, we could start off sort of down here, which is either sort of unskilled, inexperienced, or unfamiliar people with the process or with the practices, using very manual or no tools at all. And what we find is we need pretty well detailed instructions, regular supervision, a high level of checking. But typically, because it's a manual-based thing, there's low levels of measurement in there, other than possibly the results. But the process is not very defined in terms of the actual combination of people and tools. As we move up the tools and we automate the tools, okay, so we're bringing in more automated tools, still with unskilled, inexperienced, or unfamiliar people, what we tend to find is a move towards manuals that tell you how to use the tools. We have regular supervision, we have periodic checks, and we start to introduce measurements from those tools that tell us what's going on. If, on the other hand, we move up towards skilled, experienced, familiar people, the competent people, but using manual tools, we tend to have guidance because the people themselves are competent, skilled, and experienced in what they're doing. Similar periodic inspections, periodic checking, and periodic measurements are happening. Now, where we could go ultimately, and not all organizations or many organizations get there, we can move up to the sort of very skilled, experienced people with very advanced automatic tools or automation involved in it. So we're combining both the skills and the tools. And what we tend to find that the amount of documentation is quite minimal. We don't need much supervision because the competence and the tool use are built into the experience of the people. There's because of the tools, there's often low levels of checking, but we do need a high level of measurement to tell us that things are panning out and working the way we would expect them to work. And ideally, we want to be thinking of a management system that moves in that direction to achieve the optimum process approach. So a colleague of mine way back did an experiment, and over the years, I thought it was fascinating, and I decided to repeat it. And I created, let me say, during some exercises in class, I created a little exercise which involved building a Lego set. I'm sure you've all seen Lego. And I split the class into 3 groups. And the first group, I purely gave them written instructions and the parts. The second group, I gave them just the picture of the finished Lego model. And the third group, I gave them the Lego model, the picture, and the Lego instructions for building it. And the interesting thing over running it of a few training courses that I was using the sort of exercise in, the interesting thing was the speed in which people completed the model. Now, I'm sure you can guess, or you might have guess at which ones were completed first. But to let you know, usually it was the second team who just had the picture that completed the quickest. The problem they always had was they had parts left over, because from the picture you can't see where all the parts go. The Second team that came in was usually the ones that had the Lego model and the instructions on how to build it. They usually successfully completed it. Took a little bit longer, but I would argue realistically took the time it needed to build it. But very, very interestingly, was that the people that had the written instructions never finished. I had to stop them, or we'd be there all day. So you can't just have a process that's written down and say, well, we've got a good process. The process has to be aligned to the exercise or the practice or the procedure or whatever it is we're trying to achieve. It has to be aligned in such a way to assist people with the degrees of competence that they've got. So what does TickITplus do? Well, what we've done, we've spent a lot of time doing is trying to write our TickITplus practices in business speak, in words that you could read through and you'd go, yeah, I recognize that. That's something we've got to be doing within our organization to achieve whatever it is the process we're talking about, human resource management, corporate management, and legal. So we've tried very hard to write them in that way. We've also added in some typical work products, both input and output. Now, we're not saying you have to have those identical work products, but we're trying to enhance the meaning of the practice by showing you what typically is produced or used as part of the process. And like most things, we don't tell you what to do. We describe the intent of what should be done, not how to do it. And that's where your competitive advantage comes in, by taking our model, using the building blocks and putting it together in a way that successfully delivers what your business is interested in delivering. Okay. Might as well just take a quick look at what a process is, because we've taken we've added to what the process, get the general process diagram is. I'm sure you've all seen the sort of classic process layout with inputs, outputs, controls, resources. That's fairly static, a fairly well-known model for a process. Let's take an example, the design review process. Take the design review as a process. I'm not going to go through them, all the inputs, outputs, controls, but let's take the input. Basically, it's a very easy input. It's an unreviewed design. So somebody's produced a design and we want to review it. The outputs that typically exist, firstly, is a reviewed design. It has been reviewed. We've got design review records. We maybe have some metrics, comments per page of specification. We may have some corrective actions. We may have a go, no-go decision. We may have a re-review or review an issue, or there may be some decision on what to do next. So we've got lots of outputs from that process. And those outputs are typically what are audited during audits. We look for audit outputs. And we do have a sort of belief that if all the outputs are there, the review is good. But we really have to ask that question. But is it a good process? Is it effective? Is it because we've got all the outputs? Well, I'm not a great believer in that, because I can create as many outputs as you want me to create. Doesn't mean I've got a good process. In fact, it's arguable it's sometimes that the more outputs, the more the process gets distracted from achieving what it has to achieve. What we need to do, though, and I mentioned it a couple of times, we need to start thinking about outcomes, not the outputs. What are the outcomes of your processes? What are they trying to achieve? And indeed, what does good look like? Do we know when the process has achieved good? And if we haven't achieved good, or we haven't achieved the outcomes, then we genuinely have a reason to do process improvement. I would argue that if an output is missing, putting that output in place or starting to create the output doesn't actually improve the process. It may well improve compliance to a process, but not necessarily the process. But if the outcome is not doing what we want it to do, and we improve, then we genuinely are improving the process. And the first thing that really does beg the question is, do you actually know what the outcome of all your processes are? What the processes are actually trying to achieve and what good looks like? In this case, of course, the outcome of a good design review, not the design itself, we're looking at the process for design review. The outcome of a good design review is a design that is error-free and can be implemented unambiguously. And that saves time, rework, mistakes, inaccuracies, etc. So the focus there is, if we are getting rework, time, mistakes, inaccuracies, then we really do have a need to improve the process, the design review process, because that's one of the tools for addressing designs. So what have we done in TickITplus? Well, every process that we've added, and I mentioned it a little earlier, every process in TickITplus, we've tried very hard to define in a generic way, bearing in mind that TickITplus can be used by many organizations. We've tried to define what we would see as an outcome of the process. And the outcome we were trying to define is the outcome of what good would look like. It's probably rare that the outcomes will ever be achieved, because we've used words like there will be no rework, there will be no errors, there will be no issues. Now, that's a bit of an absolute goal, but let's face it, it's better to head towards that direction than some kind of loose, willy-nilly type statement that doesn't really drive improvements. So we've gone in with the sort of ultimate, this is where you ought to be heading towards on your journey of improvement. Okay. What happens, though, I find over time, people do lots of improvements, and I'm not really convinced often that they are improvements. They tend to just be change. And if we're not careful, change becomes confusing. We just start adding stuff to our processes and our procedures. We keep changing and tinkering with things. Then we start losing bits because things are getting all confused and we're not sure what's there. It's getting more complex. And then eventually it gradually becomes inefficient. It doesn't actually do what we want it to do anymore. And worse still, people decide on their own to take their alternative methods of doing it their way because the processes have not kept up with what's needed. The answer to this really, and it was sort of hinted at a little while ago, are in the measures, and that's measuring the outcome. Now, again, referring to a colleague of mine, a past colleague, Peter Lawrence, he did a very interesting presentation, and he looked at this, and he thought, well, is process improvement a craft or is it a science? And he picked on the Merlin engine that Rolls-Royce were developing back in the 30s and looked at that. And they were going through a phase of, quote, engineering it. And what that really meant was they'd change something, try it, blow it up, change something, try it, blow it up, etc. And they sort of got into the mode of trying to adjust one parameter and another parameter would go out, and they tried to change nothing. And eventually they got this guy called Sir Stanley Hooker. And he was a mathematician from Oxford. And they employed him to come on work on board the Merlin engine. And he was in charge of the supercharger on it. And through mathematics, through measurements and calculations, he managed to achieve a 30% improvement in the performance in a matter of months that the engineers had tried to do for a matter of years. And that's through measuring the parameters and understanding what the process is doing. So it really does lead to an interesting situation of, the pen is almost mightier than the spanner. So what have we got in TickITplus to sort of help us do that? Well, TickITplus has a built-in maturity levels or built-in capability levels within it, which we've not reinvented. We've taken from a standard called ISO IEC 15504, which now has also been re-released as ISO IEC 33001. But we've used it as a kickstart, a boot start for the TickITplus scheme, and that introduces 5 levels. There are 6, but level 0 really isn't isn't a recognized level. The processes aren't even being achieved. But the levels we got are performed, managed, established, predictable, and optimizing, and they map to the TickITplus levels of foundation, bronze, silver, gold, and platinum, which are all defined within the scheme. And the importance of this is to lead up to the levels of gold and platinum, where you can use measures to predict what the process is going to do before it's done it. And then you can optimize those processes to remove the inefficiencies and the potentials for risks and problems. Now, you have to go up the capability levels because you've got to get measures of the process, not individual measures of using the process, but combining the uses of the process to get measures of how the process itself is working. And that's really done by achieving the silver level, where you've established a common process set across your organization that multiple users are making use of. And from the multiple uses, you can gather multiple sets of data. And from the data, you can start building mathematical models, a bit like Stanley Hooker did. And to get there, you have to go through the bronze level, which enables you to put in place a managed and repeatable set of individual processes that you've removed the risk from, or you've tried very hard to move the risk from. Because as you go up the levels, you can start reducing the amount of process documentation, because you're starting to rely more on measures to tell you whether the processes are working and predict when they're not working. And in order to do that, you've got to have firstly started to remove the potential risks of processes breaking in the first place. So you start off at the performed level, you move up to the managed level, then you go up to the established level, and then once you're there, you can start extracting measures to start telling you what's going on. And as an example of this, previously, previous existence, we sort of started doing this on some processes, and we had this defect detection model that we built. I've simplified it for the sake of the presentation, but basically we collected defects from each of the life cycles that we were working with. So requirements analysis, architectural design, detailed design, code and unit tests, integration test, system test, FAT, and user acceptance testing. And again, you can apply this to any model, but we collected defects and we classed comments from a review as a defect. We classed coding review comments as a defect. And of course, we classed test failures as defects. We built this model from that. And what we did was that we got a number of our projects to give us the data that they received, and then we could build a range and mean model based on the average of the defects at each of this phase. Basically just a mean and 3 standard deviations from the mean. So that represented our model of how well our organizational process was being used across the organization. And projects would come along and they would plot themselves against that model. And we could, so they could plot themselves against that model. And if they were within the tolerances, we could reasonably say that they were operating normally or as normal as we would expect them to operate within our organization, within our domain, and within our process set. Okay. On one interesting occasion, we had a project that was running way below the lower limits. Not finding many defects at the requirements analysis stage or the architectural stage or the detailed design or code unit test or integration test. And we spoke to the project manager and the people involved, and their typical answer was, defects, we don't have defects. I thought you want right first time. So that's what we're giving you. And we had the cost, compliance, and schedule all green. Everything looked all right. I'm wondering if you're all thinking what happened next at the system test phase. Well, if you haven't predicted it already, what we got was, well, what you probably expect. A huge number of defects fell out of the process, and the real question to ask, though, was when did the problem start? And if you look back at it, the problem really did start. Something went wrong. Something was unusual. Something was abnormal right back at the requirements analysis stage. And at the architectural stage. So something was happening that if we'd had this model in a way that we could have used, we could have stepped in early and said, just a second, you're not perfect. You're not delivering no defects. There's something wrong in the way that the process is being used. And we could have done an investigation before it had gone wrong, because by the time we got to the system test, costs had gone out the window, schedule had got blown. Interestingly, compliance was still there because everything was still being done the way the process, all the outputs existed, even though the outcome was dreadful. So you can potentially get to this level of predictability by going up through the maturity levels, through the defined and through the managed and through the established levels, and build the models. So pulling that together, I like to sort of think of a quote from Deming, "In God we trust, all others must bring data." And what we've got is a model here, a sort of high-level model that says you start off with well-defined, clearly communicated and effective processes. That gives you the ability to do repeatability. If you've got processes that work, think of the Rubik's Cube and the process for solving it. If we all know what that process is, we'll repeat it over and over again if we need to solve the Rubik's Cube. With repeatability, it gives us the ability to measure the process. Now, I'm not talking about measuring the outcomes, the outputs. I'm talking about the process itself is now repeatable. Even if what the process is doing is different, the process itself is measurable because it's repeatable. With measures, we got predictability, as I've just shown you. We can use those measures to predict what's going to happen. And with predictability, you've got business foresight. You can see what's going to happen in the future. You can take corrective actions early, and you can prevent customer dissatisfaction, or in other words, deliver customer satisfaction. And going right back to my Mini, that's quality. I was very satisfied with my little Mini. It did exactly what I want from when I wanted it. So we've got that built into the TickITplus scheme through the levels: bronze, silver, gold, and platinum. Finally, the other thing I'd pull out of TickITplus is the real question about who knows best about business operations, the organization or the auditor. And really, you've got to believe the organizations know best. The auditor's the facilitator and the model bringer. They understand the models. But when it comes to the business operations, you know, the organizations are the ones that know best. Now, often organizations can't admit when there's problems. They can't see the wood for the trees. They don't want to admit that things are not right. And that independent auditor is a great facilitator of seeing what organizations can't see at the time. But in essence, really, the two have to work very closely together to achieve the real results. And one of the unique features of TickITplus is the ability to have a joint TickITplus assessment team, which is made up of the external auditor or assessor and internal practitioners. And within the scheme, we've got registered practitioners and we've got registered assessors. And given some constraints on protecting conflicts of interest and other aspects such as that, we can build together and pull together a joint team to undertake your TickITplus assessment and ultimately achieve an ISO 9001 certification within that TickITplus umbrella. So my time is very much up. I have spoken quite quickly through all of it, but I'm hoping that you can get a feel for a few of the components of the TickITplus scheme and how they can be used to address a few of the sort of issues that maybe some of you have got on your minds as I've been going through this. So I finish off really with any questions.
Mr. Wynn, until now there's no questions, but just to let our guests know that there is an email in case you have any questions, which is congress@a4q.eu. I would like to say thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Mr. Wynn, for doing this presentation. Everyone's really happy. Remember, if you get registered, you will get a surprise from A4Q. And once again, thank you very, very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Session.
Thank you.